Mr. President, one of the foremost threats to our economy is the fiscal cliff. This is an issue that my Republican colleagues and I have been talking about for several months now, calling for more transparency in the sequestration that will occur at the end of the year, a replacement of the defense sequester, and action to prevent a massive tax increase on the American people. Senate Democrats who've only recently acknowledged the looming fiscal cliff are now threatening to go over the cliff unless Republicans agree to increasing taxes on America's small businesses during this difficult economic period. Now, think about that. Senate Democrats are willing to put our economy at serious risk and our national security in jeopardy unless Republicans agree to a massive tax increase on America's small businesses. And I want to point out, this is from the Washington Post over the weekend, and this is the headline from the news story. It says, Democrats threaten to go over fiscal cliff if GOP fails to raise taxes. That's the headline from the Washington Post story. And of course, the story goes on, the reporting in there, they quote senior Democrats saying that they're prepared to weather a fiscal event that could plunge the nation back into recession if the new year arrives without an acceptable compromise, which, as they've defined that, to be a major tax increase on small businesses in this country. So you think about the impact of that and what that means to people across this country. We've had now for the last 3 years a complete failure in the Senate to produce a budget. We're now faced with this fiscal cliff, which, as I said, consists of the sequestration, the across-the-board cuts that would occur early next year if nothing's done to prevent them, the tax hikes, we're going to reach the debt limit, all threaten our economy and an already anemic recovery. And it's hard, I think, Mr. President, to overstate the magnitude of the tax increases that are going to hit our economy starting next year if we don't act. Now, over the next 10 years, this tax increase would result in nearly $4.5 trillion in new taxes on American families and entrepreneurs. Well, what does that mean to the average family in this country? The Heritage Foundation recently published a study that estimated the tax increase per tax return in every state. And I'll just give you, for example, my state of South Dakota, where the Heritage Foundation estimates that the average tax increase per tax return would be $3,187 in the year 2013. Now, I would say to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, who I think many generally believe in Keynesian economics, demand-driven Keynesian economics, that the average family in South Dakota can do more to stimulate our economy and create new employment by keeping their $3,187 and spending it as they see fit, not as Washington sees fit to spend it on their behalf. Now, Tax-mageddon is a very apt description that's been applied to this fiscal cliff when you consider the impact of these tax increases not just on individual families but on our entire economy. Until recently, we could just speculate about the impact of these tax increases on our fragile economy, but the magnitude of the damage was in dispute. Well, not anymore. Last month, the Congressional Budget Office gave us the most definitive estimate yet of the impact of the nearly $1.5 trillion of tax increases that would hit in 2013 when combined with the more than $100 billion of spending cuts that would occur under the sequester that I mentioned earlier. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the combination of the massive tax increases and the sequester will result in real GDP growth in calendar year 2013 of only 0.5%. Now think about that, 0.5%. We're right now growing at somewhere, they think anyway, in the range of 1.9%, 2% this year. But in the first half of next year, or all of next year, I should say, that real GDP growth would amount to only 0.5%. And the picture is even bleaker if you consider that CBO projects that the economy will actually lose or will have a decrease in GDP of 1.3% in the first half of 2013. So you've got this Congressional Budget Office saying that over the entire year in 2013, the likelihood is it will grow at 0.5 percentage point if we don't address the fiscal cliff. But in the first half of next year, we actually see a decrease of 1.3% of economic growth. Now, according to the CBO, again, a contraction in output, or a reduction, I should say, of 1.3% of economic growth in the first half of next year would, and I quote, probably be judged to be a recession. Probably be judged to be a recession. That's according to the Congressional Budget Office, again, which is the nonpartisan, authoritative referee that we use around here to evaluate the impact of these spending and debt tax issues. And just this morning, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Ben Bernanke, testified before the Senate Banking Committee. And here's what he said, and I quote, "Fiscal decisions should take into account the fragility of the recovery. That recovery could be endangered by the confluence of tax increases and spending reductions that will take effect early next year if no legislative action is taken. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that if the full range of tax increases and spending cuts were allowed to take effect, a scenario widely referred to as the fiscal cliff, a shallow recession would occur early next year," end quote. That's according to, again, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Ben Bernanke, in his testimony just as recently as this morning. He talked about a shallow recession occurring next year and the endangerment of the recovery that's underway if we have this confluence of events happen at the end of the year. And he went on to say, and I want to quote again, "These estimates do not incorporate the additional negative effects likely to result from public uncertainty about how these matters will be resolved," end quote. In other words, Mr. President, the economic uncertainty that's associated with all these things happening at the end of the year are impacting the economy today as people are looking at how they're going to make investment decisions, and that our economy is likely to experience negative effects from that public uncertainty above and beyond the direct impacts that the CBO has incorporated into its analysis. And so let's be very clear about what the fiscal cliff means. We're not talking about a slight slowdown of a few tenths of a percent. What we are facing is the difference between positive growth on one hand, which will mean more jobs and higher incomes, and a potential recession on the other hand. We can and must provide Americans some certainty as to what their taxes are going to be next year. Now, the House of Representatives has already agreed to hold a vote to extend all of the existing tax rates before the August recess in order to avert the fiscal cliff. They're going to act on this sometime before we go out in August to extend all the rates at the end of the year, so there is certainty about what happens next year for those who are making economic decisions. Unfortunately, thus far, the Senate and the Senate Democrat leadership has only agreed to hold a vote on a plan to raise taxes on nearly 1 million small businesses. This tax increase on individuals earning more than $200,000 a year and families making more than $250,000 a year will raise taxes on more than half of all income in America earned by S corporations, sole proprietorships, LLCs, partnerships, and other pass-through businesses that pay their taxes at the individual rates. Now, just a point of clarification, that applies to a lot of mom-and-pop businesses in this country. We're talking about that restaurant owner, that electrician, many of whom are organized in a fashion in which their income flows through to their individual tax return and they pay at the individual tax rate. And so the Joint Committee on Taxation has estimated that the number of businesses that would be impacted by that is 940,000. So almost 1 million small businesses would see their taxes go up as a result of the fiscal cliff and tax rates expiring at the end of the year for those who are making more than $200,000, an individual or families making $250,000 a year. Now, according to the National Federation of Independent Business, the small businesses most likely to be hit by the Democrat tax increase employ 25% of the total workforce. So we are talking not just about the small businesses who are going to be faced with higher taxes, but we're also talking about a huge portion of the American workforce in this country. 25% of the people in this country, employees in this country, work for those small businesses who will see, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, their taxes go up as a result of the President's proposal. So we essentially have in front of us three choices. We can let all the tax rates expire, which we know is going to plunge our economy back into a recession. We can do what our Democrat colleagues want to do, which is to raise taxes on successful small businesses and entrepreneurs, slowing our economy even further and risking, according to the Congressional Budget Office and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, a recession. Or we can do what the House of Representatives will soon pass, and what I would suggest, and that is we can prevent a tax increase from hitting anyone and give the lackluster economic recovery at least a chance to gain some steam. That's what we ought to do, Mr. President. We ought to do what the House of Representatives is going to do, and that is to extend the rates for a year so that people in this country have some certainty as to what their tax rate's going to be at the end of the year. I hope that my colleagues here in the Senate and that Senate Democrats will realize, Senate Democrats in particular, the severity of the fiscal cliff and come to the table to prevent this massive tax increase and the unbalanced and troubling cuts that are going to occur to our national security if we don't take steps to avert this fiscal cliff. We've got to prevent the dangerous cuts to national defense that are scheduled to go into effect under sequestration by finding savings elsewhere in the budget. In order to do that, we need a detailed plan from the administration as to how they plan to implement the sequester. Members of Congress on both sides of the aisle have called for more transparency on the sequester from this administration, but they have so far failed to produce a plan. And Mr. President, that is simply unacceptable, and I will continue to work to see that a requirement be enacted so that the administration will finally be transparent with the American people and give all members of Congress a clear idea as to where the cuts are going to be applied. Mr. President, our economy is weak. We know that growth in the first quarter was a mere 1.9%. Expectations for the second quarter have been downgraded. We have witnessed now over 41 straight months of unemployment above 8%. We have 23 million Americans who are either unemployed or underemployed, 5.4 million Americans who have been unemployed for a long period of time. We have a weak economy. And the amazing thing about this debate is that 2 summers ago, or 2 years ago, I should say, the President of the United States said that raising taxes would strike a blow to the economy. That was at a time when we had 3.1% economic growth. We now have, as I said, according to the estimates, 1.9% of economic growth for the first quarter of this year, and expectations for the second quarter have already been downgraded. So with 41 months now, straight months of unemployment above 8%, 23 million Americans underemployed or unemployed, and the weakest recovery literally since the end of World War II, now is not the time to raise taxes. Who in their right mind would think that it would make any sense at all to raise taxes when you've got an economy that is growing at such an anemic rate, particularly given the fact that 2 years ago when we had more robust economic growth, the President said at that time that it would strike a blow to our economy if we raise taxes. So here we are with economic conditions that are much worse, circumstances that have deteriorated since then, and he's proposing a tax increase on 1 million small businesses that will impact and have a ripple effect all across our entire economy and hurt job creation in this country at a time when we cannot afford that. I would just point out one other thing, Mr. President, and that is there was another study, analysis that came out today done by R-S.D, in which they analyzed the tax hikes that would occur on small businesses next year and came to the conclusion that it would cost 700,000 jobs in our economy, that it would cost us 1.3% of economic growth, which is, again, consistent with what the Congressional Budget Office has said, and that it would reduce wages to people in this country by 2%. And so you now have the Ernst & Young study out there which suggests not only does this impact the small businesses out there who are going to see their taxes go up, but it puts at risk and in jeopardy jobs for hardworking Americans and a wage base that would actually shrink if, in fact, we drive the car over this fiscal cliff. Mr. President, we can't afford to do that. And it is irresponsible to have people out there saying that they are so anxious to prove some point or to win some argument on raising taxes that they are willing to see this country run the risk of plunging into a recession and raising the number of people who are unemployed in this country. It really is. I mean, I have to say, when I saw some of the remarks and some of these stories and some of the reporting about statements that are being made by our colleagues on the other side and members of their staff with regard to the fiscal cliff and the willingness on the part of many of our colleagues to suggest that this country could go through and endure even more difficult economic times than what we're already experiencing, even higher unemployment than what we're already seeing, was really, really pretty remarkable and truly unfortunate. And I would hope that folks would walk back from that position, walk back from those remarks, and enter into a discussion about how we might be able to provide the necessary economic certainty for our job creators and our small businesses, how we can get people back to work, how we can grow and expand this economy. Frankly, extending the tax rate should only be the first part, the short-term solution. The long-term solution is to get tax reform, comprehensive tax reform. I think people on both sides of the aisle agree with that. And if we could enter into a discussion about how we could reform our tax code in such a way that it broadens the tax base, lowers the rates, does away with loopholes and deductions, coupled with entitlement reform that we all agree has to be dealt with, or we're going to continue to see the country on a fiscal trajectory that's completely unsustainable over time, is going to lead to the situation that we see many European countries dealing with today. That's what we ought to be focused on. We ought to be providing certainty to our businesses, extending rates at least for now, until such time, hopefully next year, when we all agree that we need to sit down and solve this tax mess that we have in this country, this tax code that's become way too complicated, come up with something that's more simple, more clear, more fair, and something that makes us more competitive in the global marketplace, because right now we're losing to a lot of countries around the world simply because we have a tax code that is just makes American businesses non-competitive in the international marketplace. Tax reform, entitlement reform, a comprehensive energy policy, regulatory reform. It's not that hard to fix this if we have the will, the political will to do it. But we can't start by saying to small businesses in this country that we are going to raise your taxes next year, run the risk of plunging the country into a recession and in increasing the number of people in this country who are unemployed. That is the exact wrong prescription. We ought to be providing certainty, extending the rates, and getting into a discussion and hopefully action on legislation that would reform the American tax code to make us more competitive in the world, do away with costly, overreaching, excessive, and burdensome regulations that are making it more difficult and more expensive to do business in this country, an energy plan that makes sense, that relies upon American sources of energy, and in a spending plan, a budget, something the Senate hasn't done now for 3 years, an actual budget. Lo and behold, go figure, that we could actually do a budget in this country that puts us on a more sustainable fiscal path by reforming entitlement programs that will actually save Social Security and Medicare for future generations of Americans. That is the long-term prescription to what ails America, but it's certainly, in the short term, it makes matters much, much worse when we talk about piling a tax increase on the very people that we're looking to create jobs and to get this economy back on track. I hope that this Congress will come to its senses about this and that we will vote down any proposal that would raise taxes on hardworking small businesses and entrepreneurs in this country and instead give them the certainty that they need for the months ahead until such time when we can deal with the issue of tax reform. Mr. President, I yield the floor.